Yeah, just like also Michael said, I have a book out there for sale. It's essays that were in Rotary magazine over the last like 10 years, and where I was a columnist, and I was recently in Guyana. So this book was kind of, it's a little bit over to the east, but it's kind of. I was kind of in a good mindset for reading this. And Alan, you grew up here in the Twin Cities area?
Yeah.
Is that right? And this book won the Dzanc Book Prize for Fiction, which was sent it in, and there was hundreds of books sent in, and this one was picked, right? Correct. And that prize is created to recognize daring, original, and innovative writing. And I'll just say, I really like this book. I thought it was a really rich way of looking at this conflict. It often gets like flattened out into kind of two sides and two dimensions, and I thought the characters were really rich, and it was great to follow their arc kind of through as it kind of evolved and changed. And so yeah, maybe you can want to read a section, and then we can talk a little bit about it.
Cool. All right. All right, thanks everybody for coming. We've got a great mix of people from my childhood over here, my family's here, my mother's book group, where's Beth? There you are. Yeah, Beth drove 6 hours from central Illinois to get here. And we were walking around Lake of the Isles this afternoon and got caught in a rainstorm. And we ordered an Uber, and then the rain stopped, and we canceled it, and then we made it around the lake and got here. So, yeah, and, maybe we'll get into this in the conversation, but one thing that came up at a reading I was just doing in New York is that I was thinking a lot about my mother, who is a retired psychoanalyst and spent her whole career listening. And I think this book is a lot about that. Listening to people. The research for the book was about listening and, going to the place where this conflict occurred and just really spending time with people and realizing how much people wanted to talk to me, right, and wanted sort of a neutral listener to be there. So I think that does very much come from my mother. So thanks to her. I'm going to read, this should be pretty easy to jump in. It's from the opening of the novel, and it's about, shouldn't be more than 10 minutes. The first thing is the epigraph, and I might say just one quick thing about it, but I think that'll also maybe set up things a little bit for our discussion. The epigraph is it's an article, it's a piece of journalism by a Colombian writer named Alberto Salcedo Ramos, and it's titled "The Town That Survived a Massacre to the Sound of Flutes." And now she says that she is still bleeding, but in the village, since the time of the massacre, there's no permanent clinic or doctor. I watch her in silence. I close my notebook. I say goodbye to her, and I move away, trying to walk carefully and not slip on the steep hill. I see muddy streets. I see a mangy dog. I see a shack with bullet holes in the wall. And I tell myself that the paramilitaries and the guerrillas, despite being a pack of killers, are not the only ones that have trampled these poor people. And so I think the only thing I want to say is that I think one of the objects of the book is to look at who are these other people, right? On the surface, you have men with guns and men with armbands, and you have camouflage, and you have killers. But then there are these other larger forces behind it that aren't reckoned with generally, and so the book explores that. This is from section 1, which is titled "The Strike," 1990. Chapter 1. They came down from the mountains and across the fields on horses and motorcycles and trucks and on foot. They blocked the road to the ocean and blew apart the bridge over El Rio Curralao that connected plantations to the port in Turbo and the canal in Nueva Colonia. Before dawn, they invaded the fields of the first banana plantation, Finca La Bella, and cut the head-high cables for transporting banana stems, then attacked the empty office, dousing with gasoline its desks and shelves and ledgers that contained salary numbers and an inventory of how many bananas planted, and how many boxes shipped, and with what exporter. They tossed gasoline across wall maps with little red pins to mark the fumigations, and blue pins to mark the next rows due for harvest and shipment. A terrified security guard, an old man with a rusty Winchester double-chambered shotgun, emerged from the bathroom, and they handcuffed him, slid a blindfold over his eyes, and later dropped him on the outskirts of Apartado, where he was lost for a day. They doused the packing area, the high stacks of flattened banana boxes, the rubber conveyor belt, the steel tubs, the thatched roof of the cafeteria, and the little store that sold drinks and sandwiches. Next to the giant steel tubs, they cut all 9 cables that united in the packing area and spread out on a grid across the fields. They poured a trail of gasoline out to the road, and the leader, Samuel Yuletis, a.k.a. Orejas, dropped a match, as he dreamt of doing as a child. The grass and gravel lit up blue and orange, and as fast as he could blink, the whole conglomeration of buildings and awnings were on fire, and in a state of the greatest beauty and vitality, like the open eyes of a man right before death. The heads of the nails Orejas had pounded into the wood glowed brightly in the fire. He still had little white scars on his hands from when he used to sweat in these fields for Mr. Morris, and his comandante had allowed him displeasure to burn down the thing he had helped build. Though he wanted to stay and admire it, there was no time. It was dawn, the sun already pushing over the Sierra to the east, and there were more plantations to burn. Simultaneously, Gerardo Reyes, his manager at Finca La Bella, was dragged from the doorway of his house in Apartado, and a guerrilla in plain clothes with a red bandana over his face shot him twice in the side of the head so that his skull fell apart on the pavement, while his wife and children hid under the bed. 5 other managers were murdered in their beds or doorways while their plantations burned, and word traveled fast among the workers, the grunts, the dirty ones, the slaves, the illiterates, the strong-wristed, the ones with 2 machetes strapped to their waists, the ones who inhaled pesticides from the plains, who killed snakes in the drainages, who broke their backs dragging the stems on cables, that today was not just an insurrection against the planters, but a general strike across the country. The guerrillas set fire to the gravel runways and the airplane hangars. In Apartado, they burned down the Banana Corporation office with its computers, typewriters, fax machines, file cabinets, telephones, maps, inventories, and little family photos taped to the sides of desks. They surrounded the factory that made the blue plastic bags for the banana stems, and the other one that made the cardboard banana boxes. Here they shot Armando Benavides, a security guard who raised his shotgun, not realizing that the factory was surrounded by men with better guns and a plan. The cardboard and raw paper and chemicals made it all burn fast. The aluminum siding of the factory melted and collapsed, a gaping hole forming where flames curled out in search of fuel. The expensive machines all burned, and this was a pleasure for the guerrillas. The more money the planters lost, the more they would feel the shame of their position. Here and there, they exchanged fire with soldiers who were caught off guard, despite their informers, and found themselves trapped on the base of the 17th Brigade in Carepa, receiving reports that the guerrillas had also cut cables and set fire to Finca San Jorge, Finca Maria del Rosario, Guaro Uno, Guaro Dos, and Finca Villa Alicia. How many guerrillas were out there? More than anyone had anticipated. The fire was either fascinating or horrible, depending on who was looking at it. The thick black smoke rising from the fields, the cement walls painted with the acronyms of their groups. For some, the smoke tasted like progress, a better salary, and justice against the planters for killing workers and union leaders. For others, for some of those who worked on those same plantations, for the wives of the dead managers, for the pilots of the fumigation planes, it smelled like the end of everything, the tenuous order that held them together over the last couple of years. It smelled like war. While a few trees near the packing areas caught fire and burned, the wet, fertile soil around the bananas mounted on humps of soft earth along the drainages did not burn. But the bananas that were supposed to be shipped that day began to ripen on their stems. The rhythm of the operation, measured down to the hour and minute, was interrupted. It would not resume for 45 days. Every field from Chigorolo to the ocean would have to be cleared, the stems and leaves and roots, all of it chopped down and hacked into fertilizer. Not far from the road from Finca La Bella was Finca Los Bongos, where guerrillas set fire to the 4 buildings in the packing area, including the old encampment where workers used to live with no privacy, shat in holes and cooked over fires. Now it was a place to store equipment, and there was also a tractor trailer with a couple pickup trucks. Into their gas tanks, Orejas shoved fuses. Someone said they should siphon the gas first and sell it at the port in Turgo. But Orejas, nicknamed for his big ears and knowledge of so much hearsay, a sea-like memory with the names of people who had crossed him in his 20 years since birth, his mother's ex-boyfriends, his brother's enemies, the names and origins of every prostitute at La Picardía, so you had to be careful what you said around him, said the more gas, the louder the boom, and he wanted to hear it. His younger brother had worked here when it belonged to the German, and after Mr. Morris had fired Orejas, he had begged for work at this same office. Orejas unraveled the waxy fuse to join the others, told everyone to move past the gate to the road, and he lit a match. The boom was exquisite. The guerrillas flinched and a couple ducked behind a tree, but kept their eyes open. The cab of the tractor trailer levitated for a moment over a spring of blue flames and smashed through the roof of the packing area. Orejas was mesmerized. It woke him up even more, and he knew the planters, safe in Medellin, would see it in photos and know he was more trouble to them than La Vacuna they should be paying, and the workers they should stop killing. It was payback for the massacres at Finconduras, La Negra, and Punta Coquitos. It was power in its purest light. You could burn down all the temples and cathedrals and all the scriptures and all the statues of saints and even the equestrian statues of the liberators and conquerors who thought themselves gods but were just opportunists. You could burn the rich in their cars. You could drag Mario Zuluaga Espinel, the owner of Finca San Jorge, and rub his face in the ashes for the murder of 20 workers. You could sink the gringo ships over the water. You could dynamite the policemen trapped within their sandbag bunkers. While most towns in Colombia were built with a main plaza and a cathedral, a bell and a tower to be rung for mass, the towns in Urabá had no design, no sacred places. They were all ramshackle, one street dug into another, one neighborhood spilling out the backside of a banana field. Orejas believed they were meant to be burned. Take this with me.
Yeah, good idea. That's great. I love that quote. I wrote that down, the quote about how the smoke smelled like different things to different people. And I thought that was one of such a strength of the book, because you can see things from all different kinds of points of view. So I was kind of wondering, and I know some of you probably already know this, but like, I know you lived in Colombia for a few years, and maybe you could just say a little bit about how you ended up there and what you were doing.
Yeah, so I moved to Colombia in 2001, and I lived there about 3 years, and I went down there mainly because of the war. I was interested in writing about the Civil War. I was interested in writing a bit about the drug war. And right when I got there, the peace negotiations with the guerrillas broke down. And so the war intensified. And it was a dramatic moment in the country. I remember in my apartment, more or less in the center of Bogota, the government made this huge dramatic gesture of showing how they had built up their arsenal during the peace negotiations. And so they sent this parade of tanks down the main street, right, to show off. And then the guerrillas sort of did the same thing. They said, well, we've also been building our arsenal while we've been negotiating, right? And so there wasn't really an appetite for peace at that moment.
So you just went down there by yourself, like independently?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I went down there in a relationship with somebody. We broke up in a month. So then I just went on with life, right? So it's not as, everybody wants your life to have this coherent logic. I don't know that it does, right? There's a lot of arbitrary things that happen. But the only thing I would add is that, in those years, 2 of my very close friends were from the banana zone. And those stories felt very distant in that they were living in Bogota. It wasn't really possible to travel there. This is in 2001, and at that point, and this sort of is a little bit beyond the end of my novel, it was totally paramilitarized. And so moving there was going through one essential roadblock and questioning after another. What are you doing here? Who are you? And it was super oppressive. I mean, every move was controlled. It wasn't just...
Did you go there?
No, at that moment I didn't. I just heard stories and sort of thought, okay, maybe someday I'll get there. And so when I went back in 2018, I went with a load of contacts. I went with, people that these friends knew, and then eventually the person to whom the book is dedicated, Anila Jimenez, met me there. We started, we would meet, and she has 20 brothers and sisters, and so I started to, meet with the family and go to banana plantations and listen.
Gotcha. So that was in, I was gonna, so just backing up, so you were there for a few years originally?
Yeah.
And living in Bogota, and then kind of thinking about the war, writing about the war. Is that what your first book was about also? Or no?
Yeah, I mean, I think so one of the weird things about being in Bogota, at least at that point, was that people didn't leave the city that much, right? Unless you had to. I mean, if you lived in the countryside, you had to, that was your reality. But in Bogota, it was like, you took a plane to the coast if you wanted to go to the beach. You couldn't drive it. You were going to run into the war somehow.
Right.
And so Bogota was like this bubble, right, where the war was on TV, right? I mean, the war was this sort of distant thing, and it was also represented by the displaced. So refugees coming in from the countryside, and so in Bogota is very much about a family displaced.
Mm-hmm. Bogota, your novel called
The novel,
Bogota.
the novel,
Yeah.
and that's set not in Bogota, it's set an hour outside the city in a place called Casuca. And Casuca was people fleeing the war.
Gotcha. So, okay, so you were there for a few years, then you left and wrote Bogota, and then when did the Banana Wars book start, or when was the seed kind of planted for that?
I think in a way, I'd been thinking about bananas for a while, right? I was sort of thinking about just how like one object, right? This one fruit that you import connects all these people, right? Connects all these distant lives with somebody shopping at a supermarket. And that was sort of the seed, I didn't know what to do with that. I think I thought about it for years. And then I was in a conversation with my agent. I said, I want to write a novel about the banana industry. And she said, oh my God, I've always wanted a banana book. And so sometimes that's all you need to hear, right? And so in emails, we just refer to it as the banana book. And I went, what's funny is one of my good friends from Uruguay was not in Uruguay. I went to see him in another place in a conflict zone.
That's
and we hung out.
Uruguay is the town where...
Uruguay is the whole book, yeah. That's where it's mostly set.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then anyway, he set me up with all these contacts, and he said, here's the guy I want you to pick up at the airport, who immediately became a very important part of the research in the story, right? Which was totally unexpected, but he and I started hanging out. He drove me places, and he told me his whole story. And his story was the whole trajectory of the war, right? He was one of those people who never left and survived the war, and
Yeah, and then I read you were saying that you originally wanted to write a simple novel that's like a deathbed confession about an American banana executive.
That's right, yeah. That would be much easier.
Did you actually start that?
I did, of course. Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge fan. I've read this book, I don't know, 10 times, and I've taught it over. My students never like it, but I do it anyway, right? Sometimes they'll thank me later, right, in a decade or so. But I love Roberto Bolaño's By Night in Chile, and it's a deathbed monologue by a priest who was part of the Opus Dei order that collaborated with the Pinochet dictatorship, right? And he's confessing without confessing. He's sort of talking about all the things that he did. He just justifies himself for 120 pages. And I think this is brilliant, right? So I thought, okay, I'm going to do this with a Chiquita banana executive, right? And I was very interested in Chiquita because Chiquita paid armed groups, and Chiquita is in a legal process still today.
In Colombia?
In Colombia, yep. There's a jury trial going on like right now. Yeah, so I wrote this guy, and I also went there thinking, okay, if I'm going to write this guy, I want to see it from the other end, right? I want to know the story of the people who actually suffered through this war. I mean, this guy lived in a cubicle in Cincinnati or in Medellin or something, right? When he was going to meetings. Anyway, and then the book expanded and got much harder, right? I brought in all these other strands to it.
Yeah.
Harder to read, harder to write, right? I'm sorry, you'll have to deal with it.
No, it's not hard to read. I imagine it was hard to write though, because you've got like that 4, maybe 5 different four main characters for sure. But then, I found myself really liking Orejas. I mean, he's kind how he's kind of there but not there, but you can see his arc as he goes from one side to the other side, and I don't know, I kind of thought, sometimes I thought he was kind of the thread that the whole book was kind of wrapped around, but then other times it seemed like Yennefer, the woman, was the main character. Do you have any thoughts on who's the main character?
I mean, this has been kind of the interesting thing about talking with some readers is that.
Sorry.
Oh, you're good. I think when I gave it to my agent, she felt very strongly about Jennifer, and I did too, and Nancy as well. And she said the women carry the book, right? That they're the two people that you kind of can root for, because everybody else is very complicated and has quite a shadow, right? Nordekas does too. But as I'm giving readings, and there was just a very nice review in the Wall Street Journal, and the person he wanted to write about was Orejas as well. And that keeps coming up. And then I was at a reading, there was a writer in New York, and she was obsessed with Orejas and had lots of questions about it. I think that's great, right? I'm happy that people are, figuring out just, I don't know, just are invested in him.
Yeah. No, I thought he was a really interesting character. So, were there? That's maybe an annoying question for a novelist, but like, are there people's lives? I mean, obviously, the guy you talked to, who you took pieces of for these characters. Anybody in particular? Or?
Well, it's interesting. The story. This isn't really in the novel, but it's kind of just an interesting anecdote about how you survive in Urabá, because what would happen is it was completely, when the book begins in 1990, the banana zone was controlled by guerrillas. And banana planters, if you owned any land, you lived in Medellin. And you ran your operation over the phone. And over the phone, your managers would get murdered. The guerrillas would be at the banana plantation, which is not much more than a big field with bananas and a packing area. And the land was devalued, right? I mean, of course. And so this taxi driver was a manager at a banana plantation, and one day got on his motorcycle to go to work, and two guerrillas came to his door and tried to kill him. So he fled to the city, and they said, he was a snitch for the paramilitaries, because the paramilitaries were kind of gradually moving in, moved to the city, and then eventually moved to his father-in-law's dairy farm, not that far from Apartado where he had been living, but far enough away. And then paramilitaries took that zone over and made everyone on a farm, right, all the dairy farms, they all had to come to town. They had to line up at the village school. And he asked somebody, hey, what's this about? And he said, well, they're going to kill us. And they were, that was actually happening. They were just lining up men against the wall and killing them against the school. So he got to the table and he meets the commander and gives him his ID, and he says, are you a snitch for the guerrillas? And he said, look, I've been displaced by the guerrillas. All I want to do is work this dairy farm. I've lost my house. I've lost my livelihood. I just want to work. And so he said, go work, walk away. So he started backpedaling toward his mule and got on his mule and took off, right? But then he lived through that transformation of that area, right? So in a way, that, just hearing his stories and hearing about that kind of paranoia and how this worked, right? How this process of generating terror and violence, that was important. And then I think my friend Anila, who's not in the book at all, I mean, she's this, she's also lived through it. Her father was murdered by paramilitaries in 1995. And in 1988, her whole family was displaced from their farm by guerrillas. So she also lived through everything, right? She lived through both groups. And just having conversations with her, I think all that is material for the book, but nothing, no one-to-one ratio there.
Yeah. No, I was just curious. What's the situation now in Urabá?
I think this is a good moment to maybe refer back to the epigraph of the book, which is that, one of the things that Anilda and I talk about is that in 2006, all the paramilitaries surrendered. There's this huge ceremony in Bogota and Medellin, and they take off their camouflage and the armbands, and they put down all their weapons, and they confess. So the guy who, authorized her father's murder confessed to 3,000 murders, right? And he's still in prison, but many of them are now free, right? So there was this big moment of amnesty and confession, a big truth commission. And one of the things that she and I have talked about a lot is that these are the monsters, right? These are the guys on news. These are, the guy who, authorized your father's murder, grew up poor, dropped out of school in 3rd grade, and then he became a raspachín de coca, which is he became a coca picker in southern Colombia, and then eventually ends up driving a truck in Urabá. Truck drivers know who's who, and then the paramilitaries recruit him, and then he's in. He's talented, right? He rises to the top, and he becomes a commander, right? And so this is a long way of saying that the people paying and the people kind of coordinating all this have never really had to, deal with any sort of justice, or there's been no real reckoning with that. And that, I think, is why I wanted this epigraph to kind of lead off the book, that, one of the main characters is an American banana executive who is all about profit, and he's also, at some point in the book, authorizes payments, right? Sort of brokers some of these deals with the armed groups. And that I want it to be felt that the violence is there, right? It's in the skyscrapers, it's in the country clubs. This banana executive plays a lot of tennis, right? You get to see him play tennis while this stuff is going on, and I want that connection, that back and forth tension between those two things.
But as far as the active conflict, it's not happening right now.
Yeah, I didn't even answer your question. So here's the short answer. You go to Apartado today, and it's peaceful for a couple of reasons. One is that, and relatively peaceful, the banana planters won, right? They displaced everybody.
With the paramilitaries?
Yeah, I mean, the paramilitaries took control. They're still kind of there, right? I remember, well, let me answer your question. I'll not tell this anecdote maybe, but because I asked the same question to a friend in Medellin. I was like, hey, what do the planters do now when they want to kill someone? And then he told me how it works, right? But, because I know this still goes on. But anyway, you go there and there's shopping malls and hotels and clubs, and there's a lot of drug trade there, so there's a lot of capital. And there are a lot of people who feel like this is what had to happen, right? They'll sort of make this argument. A lot of people had to die to get rid of that guerrilla, to bring in these paramilitaries who did a lot of awful things, but it was worth it. We've progressed. We are living in this modern place now. Our roads are paved, the bananas are being shipped. We've got this great, we have an Hotel Ibis, we've got this European hotel, and whereas other people would tell you, of course, none of this was worth it, right? Right. But yeah, it's sort of an example of a place that was cleansed and is now sort of economically viable, all that. Yeah.
So how do you kill somebody now?
So the story is this. I was asking my friend Raul, who grew up there and grew up through all this violence, and he now works with the UN, and he's sent into conflict zones to protect people, to get them out. He reports things to human rights groups. He wears a blue vest, which in theory protects his life. And he said that one of the things that planters are worried about is because they're in Medellin and they fly in every so often, their land is massive, is that hungry people steal bananas. So they'll go into a field, cut off a big, bunch of bananas, and walk off with it, right? Not to sell it, right? You're not going to make any profit, but to eat it. And so he said every so often, they'll call the cartel, the Gulf Cartel, which is sort of the form of the paramilitary group there now. And this is the one reason it's also peaceful there, is that the cartel, they control everything. There's no dispute with other cartels. They'll kill somebody, and then they set him up in front of a banana plantation at a gate with his arms wrapped around banana stem as a symbol, because they don't steal the bananas, right?
Yeah. It's a clear message.
Yeah. So it's to say, like, oh, everything's very peaceful, and then every so often there's a dead body at the banana plantation gate, just so everyone knows, right? Yeah, don't steal bananas.
Well, on that note,
Right.
we should probably take some questions from the audience. I'm sure there's a few. So, anybody? Yes.
Who are all the different players in this conflict, and why the conflict?
We should repeat the question after.
Oh, sure. So yeah, you were asking who are the different players and what causes the conflict?
Yes.
I think the kind of the interesting thing is that the history of this place is that it didn't exist in the 1960s. It was all jungle and small farms, and then kind of in the late 60s, they realized this had perfect climate for bananas, right? So people from all over the place, from Europe, the United States, a lot of Colombian planters, mostly from Medellin, thought, let's create a banana industry. Pushed out the small farmers, bulldozed the jungle, right? Brought in people to build, drainages and clear out like everything that could be in the way to make a field. And then the American banana companies came in and built canals to get it out to the ships because there's no good place to have a port. And originally things were pretty good. If you talk to people in the banana region, nobody's from there originally. They talk about their parents and their grandparents. They're usually from El Chocó or Córdoba, which are two neighboring regions. And they will tell the story that they came in and they lived in camps. And it was tough, right? There wasn't housing, there was no infrastructure, there were no schools, but it was pretty good money, right? So initially things were okay. And then, and sort of the cause, if you ask anybody, is that the planters were greedy. They were making tons of money off the bananas. They didn't want to pay, they didn't want to build infrastructure, they didn't want to build houses. So people unionized, and then union leaders were immediately killed, and workers who joined unions were blacklisted or killed. This is sort of the response from the planters to labor organization. And so guerrillas were formed, and the guerrillas protected and began attacking planters. And that's the seed of the conflict. Everything goes to shit, right, with that. Yeah.
Were the planters American companies?
It's a mix. Yeah, I mean, one of the weird things about this history is that Americans were very used to getting their way in Latin America with bananas. However, initially they made a deal. It was I think it was like a 10-year contract with the Colombian planters where as soon as a banana was cut, it belonged to the Americans, right? It was going to be imported. They had already bought it. That contract expires, and the Americans sent in really bad terms. And they thought, here's where we're going to cash in, right? We're going to enforce this contract. If they don't sell to us, they're going to lose access to the American market, so they're going to take it. And the Colombian planters were like, we're not going to deal with you guys anymore. And this is kind of the difference. They were dealing with very sophisticated business people in Medellin who said, we're done with the Americans. We'll find a way to sell you our bananas. We have our own people to import them in the United States. So they did, right? And then America's not involved in the Colombian banana industry at all. These U.S. companies are very involved in Guatemala and Costa Rica and Ecuador and all these places, right? But for a time, they were not there until about the time of the book, the late 80s, they want to get back in. So Chiquita forms a subsidiary, a Colombian company called Banadex. And Banadex buys up a bunch of land, they open a big skyscraper in Medellin, and they're back in the banana business. Yeah. It was just too lucrative. The Colombian bananas were good, it was easy shipping, all those things, right? And so the book kind of brings in that history a little bit. Maybe, I don't know. One of the things when you research a book, you want to get all the history in, then you realize you got to tell the story, right? So it's nice to have an event like this where I can spew all these historical facts for you. Yeah.
So what was the research like? I mean, it sounds like there's kind of the personal aspect of the people, but then also like the backstory of the corporations and those parties. So it's like really interesting, but it seems like it's two very separate but kind of overlapping approaches.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I haven't repeated the questions very well. Go ahead.
No, the question is, what was the research like?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, initially, I wanted to see the landscape, right? I wanted to kind of feel the heat, see the rain, talk to people. My friend Emilda's brother-in-law is a manager at a banana plantation, so he walked around with me, taught me everything, right? All the diseases. Bananas are super disease-prone, right? And they have to be perfect. Colombians eat bananas that look all kinds of shapes and colors, and Americans want the very perfect Cavendish banana, right? If there's even a scar on it, like, they won't take it, right? So I wanted all that, right? And a lot of that was just oral. I was just listening to everybody. But then I got home and to Atlanta, and I started reading books. I started reading history. I read a lot of business history, but also a lot of oral history. So I wanted to go not just to where the book begins, but all the way to the beginning, right? To the 1950s and 60s, to just get at the roots of who was living there, what it was like, even if that's not totally in the book, it's always in the book, right? And I also read, so eventually Chiquita did pay a huge fine to the U.S. Justice Department, and so I read their sentence, right? They signed an agreement with Eric Holder, who was Obama's Attorney General, and I think they had to pay like a $2 million fine or something like that. But all that whole settlement has all the payments. The date, the person who delivered it, person A, person B, And it has all the memos from the Chiquita Banana executives, all the lawyers actually, speaking of lawyers, saying stop making the payments. This is a listed, the U.S. Justice Department has this group listed as a terrorist. Please stop making the payments. And then the payments keep continuing. And you keep reading it. Oh my God. So the lawyer's saying stop, 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 and the payments go on and on. You're like, oh, wow. So there's some drama there too, right? Just reading the numbers. Yeah.
Yeah, as you start accumulating knowledge and you start making contacts on plantations about different stories, did you have to worry about either the guerrillas or the paramilitary in terms of being on a hit list? If
No,
they knew you
no.
were going to write.
So the question is whether you had to worry about personal safety when
Yes.
your research of this.
I think I was more worried about the people talking to me, right? I wanted them to be safe. I didn't think anyone was going to mess with me. I think that, I was just asking questions, and like I said, I think everything's has been at a pretty calm moment. The workers on banana plantations have achieved reasonable terms, right? They're getting paid okay, they have pensions, they have health care, their kids are going to school. Things like that, and so things are relatively calm. And so, I think the only thing that I was worried about is, one of the things I noticed on my first trip is that nobody wanted to talk to me in public, right? If we were sitting in a public cafe, everybody's looking over their shoulder, right? So I thought, okay, I don't want to mess with that. So I'd say, can I go to your house? And then I get invited over and we could talk there. We'd talk, or we'd be on the road. I mean, one of the things that we'd get in the car with somebody, that was a great place to talk. We'd be looking at the road and we'd stop and they'd say, oh, and then this thing happened here, or this is where my father grew up, but this is where my aunt is from, and so a lot of that, yeah.
What if you went back?
What's that?
What if you went back after your book?
I go back every year. I go back
So
constantly.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I mean, for me, this isn't like a one-off thing. I'm very close with Anilda's family, and she and I have just filmed a documentary about her father's murder and the return to the land of her family, and both of her family farms were stolen. That was one of the motives for the murder. And so one of the farms has been recovered. And so we're making a short documentary about that. Yeah. Yeah, Joel?
So when you were there in 2003, do you feel more hopeful about just how Columbia feels and just how people can live right now than back then? Or is it more mixed than just being hopeful and optimistic about how the country is for average people? Because I mean, it sounds like the violence just shifted. I guess when we've talked, it's different than it was, but it's not kind of as static.
The question is whether you feel more or less hopeful about Columbia's future.
I think I was hopeful in 2016 when the guerrillas surrendered. I thought something might happen. And everybody was. Colombians were excited. During the negotiation, there were no massacres, or very few. You just stopped reading in the news about community leaders being killed, union leaders being killed, particularly in regions that are especially tense, right, where there's oil, where there's coca laboratories or, drug corridors. And I remember going there I think it was like in 2017, and everyone's thought things are calm, and then immediately that changed, right? President Santos, who had negotiated the peace agreement, went out of office. And Duque took over, and hope was kind of gone in a way, right? At that moment.
Was he a conservative? I don't know.
He was super conservative, yeah. I mean, he was just he was sort of a manifestation of Alberto Uribe, right? Yeah, I mean, this is complex to talk about. But I think what's happened, and partly I told the story about planters, making this symbolic sort of demonstration of murder, right, to scare people away from stealing their bananas, is that there's no longer an armed group that you can point at and say, that's the AUC, the Autodefensas, right, the paramilitary group, with Carlos Castaño, who was like this, sort of this image of the devil, right? I mean, he ran this huge paramilitary movement that was doing all these, committing all these atrocities, right? And you no longer have the FARC. The FARC are also, committed all these, crimes against all these different people, right? So the conflict is sort of atomized, right? It's in the fabric of all these different lives. It has different, maybe no armbands at all, no names, right? It's just different groups fighting for control of certain areas, right? And generally, like I said, this is always happening. I mean, once the conflict ended in Uruapa, for example, paramilitary surrender, the guerrillas are gone or dead, suddenly everybody's land is gone, right? All these like big landowners own the land, right? So like Anilda's father owned a banana plantation, her neighbor stole that land, right? So that's gone. And then this other larger piece of land initially was stolen by the paramilitaries to put in a drug runway and a drug weigh station. And then a rancher nearby was going to take the land, and then they kind of stepped in. They didn't wait for the government to let them get it back. They just went back to the land and said, "We're here."
In Nilda?
Yeah, her and
you
20
told me
brothers
that
and
story.
sisters.
That's a
Yeah,
pretty awesome story.
and you know, she basically said, "We're not going to count on the state to protect us. There's 20 of us. It's a big group. You know, we'll hopefully be okay, right?" And they have been, right? They've really established their, you know, the farm and everything there. They've done really well.
I think there's one question back there.
Yeah, so you opened this talking about your mother and being a listener.
Right, right.
And one thing that mental health therapists have to deal with is, I think the term is transference, maybe taking on people's pain too much, and that bleeding into other parts of their lives. So I'm wondering if you could talk about you've obviously taken a lot of people's really painful stories into your brain. How does that work? How do you mix that or keep it separated from other parts of your life?
I think the only thing I'll say about that is that when I was having a lot of hard conversations with people, and I think this still happens when I go there. I'll go visit somebody and they'll tell me a story I didn't know, and it's painful. Yeah, it haunts me a little. I go to bed that night and I'm still thinking about it, but I get up the next day and I make notes. I bet, maybe there's a way to write about this. And I think for me, I didn't want to trivialize any of this. I wanted to write a book that's hard. The book that it doesn't sugarcoat anything. It doesn't make it easy on the reader. It's not written for an American reader by any means, right? There's no explanation, right? That, if you're not from there, you don't want to allow yourself to see the world that way, then it's going to be a tough book, right? You've got to allow yourself to be challenged by the book and, follow the writer into it, right? So to me, that's the biggest thing, is that I hear these stories and I don't want to, I want to translate them in a way or convey them in a way that, is real.
I'll just say also, you might be making it sound worse than it is. Like, I didn't feel like it was, when I was reading the book, like it was, like I was caught in a pointless civil war. It felt like a satisfying book, and it felt like it had a forward motion, and it felt, the characters' arcs felt like, not like wrapped up, but it felt like a good, it was easy, not easy to read, but it was like it was a good read. It wasn't like super hard.
That's great. Yeah. No, at least you hear that too. Yeah. Well, I think, one thing to say about Frank, and having read a bit of his writing, both of us travel to places that have certain risks, and there are places in a certain amount of conflict, and I think neither of us really wants to be the center of that story, right? This American adventure going into the heart of darkness. I mean, we're very resistant to this, right?
Yeah, no, it's the stories that you kind of find along the way that are more interesting than your own story, for sure.
Yeah, you don't want to sensationalize anything. You don't want to,
Right. Yeah, you want to know what it's like to be there and what it's like to live there. And I felt like your book did a great job of that. Yeah, letting people know what it's like to live through that in a kind of real way. It's not like simplified in some sort of ideological way or something like that. So, yeah, I thought it was great. Yeah, I think.
I haven't finished the book, but I am struck by some of the women in the book and how they find ways to be powerful and survive. And the women are prostitutes. There's a woman that is a hairdresser. There's a woman that...
It's the same woman, by the way.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Okay. And then the
Yeah.
woman who keeps track of all the details of all the transactions, and it's like she is the most powerful person because she's got all the data.
Right.
She doesn't sound that powerful so I'm really struck by those women who find ways to make it in this mess. But it is, for so many people are getting killed.
Yeah, I think the thing about the character you're talking about is Jennifer is that she is dispossessed in the book. Her husband is murdered, and she loses, what was a bakery and becomes a bar, and in just a classic way, somebody wants what she has, and I think at that moment she figures out what's the next move for her and how she's going to protect herself. So she gets a job in the banana industry. She happens to have a friend who also rises up and protects her to some degree. But yeah, I think she's very smart, right? And she figures out how to survive in the book. Yeah.
Yeah, just as an aside, my wife, who's in the back there, teaches an accounting course at McAllister, and she gives her students extra credit if they can find a hero who's an accountant.
There it is.
It's kind of hard to find. So we have to add Jennifer to this list.
It's true. Yeah. No, she loves math. I mean, she sort of realizes that what's in those numbers is an asset to her. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that, yeah, there's a way to use that to kind of get her way out of this.
Yeah.
So that's great. Yeah, I'm happy to learn that. So, I hope she's a convincing accountant. We'll have to talk about that later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is your book available in Columbia? And if so, what is the response?
So it's interesting. There's a Colombian translator doing his PhD at Emory right now, which is in Atlanta. And he was at my launch of the book, and he's partway through the book. I mean, he's working on the book. So it's been great to talk to him about the book. And he says it's written in a very Colombian English. So I like that. Just the syntax and the way the language works. So yeah, and it's been just really fascinating to sort of see that book go through that transformation. Yeah. So eventually it'll be there. Yeah.
Yes.
So, if you bear with me, my words aren't fully formed because it's coming from a real feeling place. But what keeps coming up for me is like I'm at Byerly's and I'm looking at these bananas and I'm thinking they are so inexpensive. And then you think about all of this and the people, and like they don't fit. They don't fit. So I don't know that I expect you to have an answer, and I don't even know what my question is other than like, how does that happen? Somebody's getting very rich, other people are getting killed, and I'm buying bananas for what, 29 cents a pound, or I don't know how much they are these days, but that doesn't fit, and what you're leaving me with is just this real, just that's present for me in thinking about these people. Yeah. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think what I'm hoping for with that is that you just know there's a story there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. You bet. So thank you.
I mean, it is the other quick thing to say about money is that one of the things that comes out with the Chiquita settlement is that the tax, and this is not just Chiquita, but a lot of Colombian businesses and planters were paying this tax. It was 11 cents per box. And you think that's not that much to finance a mercenary army. It adds up. Chiquita spent $1.7 million.
Right.
So that's 11 cents times how many boxes of bananas, right? So it's a high volume.
Right. That, yeah.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, I'm getting the picture that in present-day Colombia, you'll have people who are on one side living next to people who are on the other side. Someone's father might have murdered someone else's father.
Right.
And there they are. Is that a kind of accurate picture of how it is right now?
Yeah, I mean, I was just talking with my friend Beth about this before the reading. She's read an essay that is under submission right now, and it's about walking up the street in Apartado. I was on my way to the grocery store with my friend Anilda and two of her sisters, and we ran into a guy, friendly, shook my hand, kissed the women's cheeks, had a backpack there, like, hey, you lost weight, you look good. He said, they look good. He was like, oh, this must be a cousin or something. And then he said goodbye, and she said, hey, that's the guy who killed my father. Right?
Wow.
And what's interesting is that was at a moment when she couldn't afford not to smile at him. So that was in 2019. Today, because actually there is a land restitution claim for the farm that his family stole, they're not smiling anymore. You know, they've been threatened and they've tried to blackmail one of her brothers and stuff like that. But and she said, the thing I want out of this, even if we don't get the land back, is I don't have to smile at those people anymore. You know, and that's not exceptional at all. So your question is that yes, this is very common. Everybody just has to suck it up and walk around. Yeah.
There's a little bit of a process going on.
Who knows how long it's going to take? I mean, even the land they got back, they never got the official title. Like the judge who's supposed to go with the police out to the land and just like put a stake in it and say, okay, now this is officially restituted to your family. The police won't guarantee his safety, and so he won't go. Like he cancels, and he may never go. I mean, I think that's sort of how the bureaucracy works, right? It's very Kafkaesque. I mean, this comes up a lot with everybody there. Like, oh my God, I've been in this state process for 20 years. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's buy some books. No, thank you. All right. So we'll have the authors are going to go up to the front, and what we got to do whatever it is they do.
Wow. Yeah. I wonder what his next book is going to be. Oh, his next good. New series circulating on this Friday. We have a daughter-in-law who's from Columbia, and so we've been her grandmother. Okay, give an autograph. Her mother was arrested in Columbia because she was trying to help overthrow the government and actually ended up in the United States. Her father was raised in a boarding home in Boston and not with his mother and father, which was trauma for him. I mean, there's trauma in this family that still kind of, I can feel it sometimes, it didn't get resolved. Because this mother, she did everything. She went to jail, you know, and I think, I tell her, I say, you know, this is a story. It would be great to have someone tell her life. And then he freaked out. He said, I'm not telling her story. You know, she sent me away, you know, so there's like this thing too. But